You came to church looking for life, but you left feeling emptier than when you arrived. We've talked about burnout, but what if your exhaustion isn't just about how much you're doing? What if it's about the system you're in? In our last episode, we named the quiet reality of spiritual drift and identified 3 hidden traps that pull us away: burnout, bore out, and apathy. But here's the honest question we need to ask next. Are we solely to blame for the burnout? Is it just our fault? Today, we're diving deep into the culture of Christian activity, the performance trap that makes us feel guilty for needing rest. If you've ever felt pressure to serve, show up, and smile even when your tank was empty, this conversation is for you. Let's be honest. Sometimes the church doesn't just fail to heal the tired, it helps make them tired. You know that feeling when Sunday morning rolls around and instead of joy, you feel pressure. Instead of anticipation, you feel a little anxiety. You sit in the pew, smile when you're supposed to, clap when the moment calls for it, but inside, your spirit feels still, disconnected, almost asleep. And it's confusing, right? Because you love God, you care about your faith, you want to be a part of His church. So why does this thing that's supposed to lift you sometimes feel like it's laying weight on you? If that tension feels familiar, this episode is for you. This isn't a rant. This isn't church bashing. This is a conversation, one that's been sitting under the surface for a lot of us, I know for me especially, because drift doesn't always happen outside the church. Sometimes it happens right inside her walls. See, spiritual drift doesn't start loud. It starts subtle. It starts when service becomes performance, when worship becomes production, when community becomes attendance. It starts when you begin to confuse busyness with faithfulness. But here's the thing. Jesus never called us to exhaustion. He called us to abide. In this episode, we're unpacking what I call the spiritual drift. This is 1.2 of the drift series because, this study and this discussion from the original one on which I talked about burnout, bore out, and apathy, it opened up somewhat of a Pandora's box for me because it led me to ask a series of questions, and I believe God has given me a series of answers to what I've been experiencing personally, and I know that I'm not the only one. So again, in this episode, we're unpacking what I call the spiritual drift, the quiet shift that happens when your soul gets busy doing things for God, but forgets how to be with God. And we're going to look at 3 ways this drift often shows up. The first way it shows up is in the performance trap, when church culture makes us believe doing more makes us holier. The second trap is the consumerism trap. This is when church becomes more like a show than a space for transformation. And the third trap is what I will call the discipleship gap. That's when community stops being a lifeline and starts being a checkbox. Each of these traps steals something vital: our rest, our intimacy, our sense of belonging. But the good news, drift is not destiny. You can come back. You can rediscover joy in your faith again. So if you found yourself sitting in a service and whispering quietly in your heart, why does this feel so heavy? I want you to know you're not alone. And this conversation, it's not about leaving the church. It's about living in her walls differently. It's about returning to design, God's design. So before we jump in, here's today's design check-in question. Am I showing up to impress God or to be impressed by Him? Because how you answer that might be the difference between drift and delight. This is the Drift series, episode 1.2, the spiritual drift, when church feels like a burden. Let's talk about it. I want you to meet a woman named Lisa. Lisa's that person everyone at church depends on. She's the first to show up and the last to leave. She leads a small group, serves in the kids ministry, sings on the worship team, and somehow still finds time to bake cupcakes for the youth fundraiser. If you've been around her, you know she's all in, always smiling, always serving. But what most people don't see is Lisa sitting in her car in the parking lot before service, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying not to cry. She's doing everything right, but she's not okay. And if we're being honest, a lot of us know what that feels like. To be needed, but not nourished. To serve out of obligation instead of overflow. To feel like stepping back would disappoint God, or worse, disappoint people. Somewhere along the way, we bought into the lie that spiritual maturity looks like doing more for God, that the busiest believers are the most faithful ones. But what if that's not what Jesus ever asked for? One of my favorite, most enlightening verses of scripture is found in Luke 10. There's a moment where it captures this tension perfectly. Jesus visits the home of two sisters, Mary and Martha. Martha's busy. She's hosting, cooking, preparing. She's trying to do everything right for Jesus. Meanwhile, her sister Mary just sits. She sits at his feet, listening, resting, receiving. And Martha snaps. She goes to Jesus and says, Lord, don't you care that my sister just left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me. But Jesus doesn't rebuke Mary. He gently redirects Martha. And he says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. And Mary has chosen what is better. You can find that in Luke chapter 10, verses 41 and 42. It's not that Jesus dismissed service. He simply reminded Martha that serving for worth isn't the same as serving from rest. If we're not careful, the church can subtly send the message that stillness equals laziness. That if you're not involved, you're not really invested. And while involvement is beautiful, it can easily turn into identity. You start believing that if you stop, everything will just fall apart. But here's the truth. The church doesn't stand because you hold it up. It does not stand because your pastor holds it up. It stands because Christ holds you up and everybody else up. Sometimes what looks like devotion is actually depletion. We run ministry like a marathon, not realizing we're sprinting toward burnout in the name of faithfulness. And when the applause fades, the affirmation dries up, and the schedule slows down, we're left with the scary question, who am I if I'm not doing something for God? When your identity becomes tied to your productivity, your spiritual life starts to feel like a checklist. Pray, check. Serve, check. Post a Bible verse on your story on Facebook, Instagram. Post a video on TikTok, check. But the moment you miss one, guilt rushes in like a flood because performance Christianity is built on fear. The fear of not being enough, not being noticed, not being useful. And fear is a terrible motivator for faith. Jesus does not invite us to perform for him. He invites us to abide in him. In John 15:5, it says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Notice that fruit isn't forced. It flows out of connection. You don't make a branch more fruitful by shouting at it to try harder. You water the root. So maybe the question isn't, am I doing enough? Maybe it's, am I still connected? There's actually a psychological term called the helper's high. It's the rush of dopamine we get when we serve others. It feels good, deeply good if we're honest. But like any high, it can become addictive. You start chasing the feeling of purpose instead of the source of purpose. And that's where the drift begins. When your worth depends on your usefulness, your spiritual rhythm turns into spiritual exhaustion. Lisa's story isn't unique. It's epidemic. So many believers, so many Christians are serving from empty tanks, showing up every week out of duty, not delight. And then we wonder why our joy's gone missing. Think of a lot of pastors that are burned out, that have fallen into some kind of scandal, have fallen into some kind of addiction. I can guarantee a lot of times that it starts because they are serving on an empty tank. Schedules packed with doing God's work, but they make no time for God, and they're more susceptible to temptations, to certain addictions, certain traps. I want you to notice the beautiful part about the Martha and Mary in Jesus' story in Luke chapter 10. Here's the beautiful part. Jesus never scolds Martha for serving. He simply invites her to slow down, to sit, to be. It's not about doing less. It's about doing it with him. Because when you serve with God instead of for him, it stops being heavy. Your ministry becomes worship again. Your faith starts breathing again. So maybe this week, your spiritual act of worship isn't another yes to whatever you're asked to do. Maybe it's a sacred no. Maybe it's stepping off a ministry schedule to step back into intimacy. Maybe it's letting someone else take the lead while you rediscover the voice of the one who called you. Let's pause for a moment with this reflection. Rest is not laziness, it's alignment. When you stop striving and start abiding, you remember who you are, and more importantly, whose you are. The design check-in question, the second one that I have for you, is to ask yourself, am I doing this for God or with God? Because how you answer that question will reveal the true source of your energy. Here's a word to live by. God doesn't need your performance. He desires your presence. When you start living by design, rooted in connection, not compulsion, you realize that slowing down isn't falling behind, it's finding your way back. Picture this. It's Sunday morning. The lights are dim, the screens glow, the fog machine hums softly as the countdown hits 0. The band or the worship team steps on stage or steps into the pulpit. The music swells. And for a few moments, it feels absolutely electric. You feel the presence of God. The energy in the room is thick, hands raised, voices soar. It's inspiring. It's emotional. It feels like heaven. But then Monday comes. That same faith that felt so alive in the room feels flat in the real world. The worship high fades, and suddenly the gap between Sunday and the rest of the week feels like an ocean. Now, don't get me wrong, excellent worship isn't the problem. Excellence in worship isn't the problem. Creativity, sound, lighting, those can all be powerful tools for connection. The problem is when the church becomes a show and the people become spectators and the atmosphere replaces authenticity. When production outpaces presence. When we start reviewing church like it's Netflix. That sermon didn't hit like the last week's sermon did. The worship was a little off today. Sister was off key. She didn't hit the notes right. The vibe was weird. Without even realizing it, we start consuming faith instead of cultivating it. So somewhere in the evolution of church culture, we began equating impact with impression. If it looks polished, it must be powerful. If it feels moving, it must be meaningful. But sometimes an emotional hype can masquerade as spiritual health. We start chasing the feeling of God rather than the formation of God. And when the feeling fades, we drift. The modern church is full of people who are inspired on Sunday, but insecure by Wednesday, because the fuel that drives them isn't intimacy, it's adrenaline. You can't sustain your soul on spiritual entertainment. It might motivate you, but it won't mature you. So let's pause and ask the hard question. If the worship team has to move you for you to move, who are you really worshiping? The music or the master? John 4:23 through 24 says, true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. That verse breaks through the noise because it reminds us that worship isn't about vibes. It isn't about the anointing or some kind of feeling you get as you sing. It's about truth. And truth doesn't need production value to have power. When Jesus met the woman at the well, he didn't take her to a service. He met her in her story. Her encounter didn't need lights or a mic. It needed honesty. And that's what the church was always meant to be, a space for transformation, not performance. The early church left us a blueprint. In Acts 2:42 through 47, there is a picture that is painted that is quite different from what we have today. It had a different picture of community. And it says that they, the early church, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. That sounds so un-American. There's no mention of production, no mention of programs, just people, devoted, generous, together. It was participatory, not performance-based. Everyone brought something to the table. Everyone was something. Compare that to the modern experience, where it's easy to slip into spectating faith. You have the worship team, in which you participate somewhat like a concert. You have a choir that has A, B, and sometimes C selection. Then you have the main performance given by the pastor or the preacher or the speaker. You show up, sit down, listen, leave. And without realizing it, you've traded community for convenience. But the church was never meant to be watched. It was meant to be walked in. The truth is, consumerism doesn't just shape what we buy. It shapes how we believe. It trains us to approach faith like a subscription service. If it meets my preferences, I'll stay. If not, I'll cancel. We start evaluating churches like we do playlists on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music, or whatever. What fits my mood, my schedule, my taste? But faith wasn't designed for customization. It was designed for consecration. You can't grow deep roots in a faith you keep switching out every season. When your faith is built on consumption, it collapses when it's no longer convenient. When your worship depends on atmosphere, it evaporates when the emotion does. Consumerism also creates distance because when you're spectating, you're not participating. You start seeing the people up front as performers and yourself as an audience member. But God never called us to attend the church. He called us to be the church. And that's the antidote to consumer drift, realizing that you are a living part of the body, that your contribution matters, even if no one claps for it. The worship isn't about how loud the song is, but how surrendered your heart is. So here's the challenge. What if we stopped rating our Sundays and started responding to them? What if instead of saying, that sermon didn't hit, we ask, did it convict me? What if instead of saying, worship wasn't powerful today, we ask, was my heart open to encounter? When you shift from consuming to contributing, something sacred happens. Your faith roots deepen. You stop needing the hype to hold you up. You stop chasing the feeling because you found the foundation. Here's the Live by Design spotlight. You don't go to church, you are the church. When you remember that truth, everything changes. Church stops being an event and starts being an expression. Worship stops being a genre and starts being a life posture. Because when you become the church, you stop drifting from it. Design check-in question. Ask yourself this week, do I approach church to be filled or to be formed? Because one leads to temporary satisfaction, the other leads to lasting transformation. Here's some words to live by. Faith was never meant to be consumed. It was meant to be cultivated. You don't have to chase another Sunday high. You don't have to wait for the next perfect service to feel close to God. He's not limited to the sound system or the stage or the pulpit. He's near in your Monday morning commute. He's present in your quiet prayers when nobody's watching. He's still speaking in the silence between songs. The consumer drift ends when you stop asking, what did I get out of this? And start asking, what did God get out of me today? When that shift happens, church becomes alive again. Not because it's louder, but because you're listening. Section 4, the discipleship gap. When we're connecting but not known. Let me start with a question. How many Christian influencers or content creators could you name right now? 5, maybe 10? How many people in your church actually know your private struggles? Not your highlights from social media, not your Sunday smiles, but the real, messy, unseen parts of your life. If that number is smaller, you're not alone. We live in an age of Christian content, but relational emptiness. We have podcasts, devotionals, reels, worship playlists, endless access to inspiration, but very little accountability. We scroll through sermons we'll never discuss. We post truths we never lived. We follow Jesus publicly, but suffer privately. And that's the tragedy of the discipleship gap. A church full of connection, but starving for community. Meet Andrew. Andrew is plugged in. He's at church every week. He attends events. He's known by name, but not known by heart. He's active, but absent. Present, but unaccounted for. He knows how to perform community, to smile, to shake hands, to say, I'm good, when he's not. But when the lights fade and the week gets quiet, Andrew feels the ache of aloneness. He wonders, does anyone really see me? Would anyone notice if I drifted? And sadly, in many churches today, the answer is often no. See, connection is easy. You have it through Wi-Fi, through a like, through a fire emoji on someone's post. But community, real, life-giving, transformative community, that costs something. It costs time. It costs honesty. It costs proximity. Discipleship isn't a program you attend. It's a person you walk with. Jesus didn't start a ministry by handing out flyers. He invited people into his life. He said, come follow me. He ate with them, walked with them, corrected them, wept with them. He didn't just preach sermons, he built relationships. And that's the piece we're losing in a modern church. We've mastered events, but we've neglected encounters. We've gathered crowds, but lost connection. Here's a biblical blueprint. Proverbs 27:17 says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. That verse doesn't work without friction, without closeness. You can't sharpen someone from a distance. Ecclesiastes 4:9-10 says, two are better than one. If either of them falls, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. That's not poetic fluff. That's survival. Because isolation doesn't just make us lonely, it makes us vulnerable. When no one knows where you're weak, the enemy knows exactly where to aim. Now, I do say this with a caveat. Yes, you should build connections with people in church, but you have to be very careful of who you build a relationship with in the church, because everyone in church is not safe for you to be vulnerable with. Some people can use certain things against you. And that is another podcast that I will have to create, certainly. Everybody in the church is not safe. I'm not promoting for you to be naive and just to trust any and everybody in the church for the sake of them being in the church. I'm not telling you to just share, intimate information with everybody, because everybody can't handle your story, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Not everyone can handle that. So, series on choosing friends in the church and outside the church is definitely set in order following this. Okay? So don't share truth with everybody. Everybody in the church is not going to sharpen you. Some of them will dull you. Some of them would not pick you down, but knock you down. Okay? So don't be naive and take what I said and just run with it. Ask God for discernment and who you should share intimate details of your life with. Be very careful with that. There's a quiet lie many of us believe, and that myth is, I don't need people. I just need God. And when you listen to it, it sounds spiritual, but it's not biblical. From the beginning, God said it's not good for man to be alone. And that wasn't just about marriage. It was about human design. You were made to be formed in fellowship. That's why spiritual drift often starts in isolation, because the moment you disconnect from people, you start distorting your perception of God. You lose the mirrors that help you see truth. You lose the voices that remind you who you are. We live in a church era where it's easier to be liked than to be loved. We share memes instead of meals. We swap verses instead of vulnerability. We say, I'll pray for you, but we don't stay to pray with you. And it's no wonder so many of us feel spiritually alone in a room full of believers, because visibility isn't the same as vulnerability. Attendance isn't the same as accountability. You can be surrounded by people and still be spiritually isolated. I've done it for years. Here's what real discipleship looks like. Real discipleship is raw, it's uncomfortable, it's costly, but it's worth it. It's sitting across from someone and saying, I'm not okay, and hearing them say, that's okay. Let's walk through it together. It's truth and tenderness walking hand in hand. It's not about fixing each other, it's about forming each other. When Jesus discipled his followers, he didn't give them a 10-step guide to become a disciple or to be fully discipled. He gave them access to his time, his heart, his humanity. He modeled what it means to love beyond convenience. That's the invitation we've forgotten, to move from community as content to community as covenant. Let's talk about the power of proximity. Let me say this gently. You don't grow in a crowd, you grow in closeness. And closeness takes courage because it means being seen. It means risking rejection. It means letting someone into your process, not just your highlight reel. But here's the truth. You can't be healed in hiding. Confession is what cracks the shell of shame. James 5:16 says, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. Healing doesn't just flow through prayer. It flows through people. And I'll say this again with a caveat. It flows through safe people, not just any kind of people that you find inside or outside of the church. Be very careful. Ask God for discernment with that. So confess. If I was to paraphrase John 5:16, I would say, confess your sins to one or two or three safe people and pray for one another. Because somebody in church or outside the church can make you feel shameful and worse than you already feel about personal sins that you've been dealing with. So ask God for discernment. Some of you listening right now have been drifting silently. You've been showing up, serving, smiling, but your soul feels unseen. You keep wondering if anyone would notice if you stop coming. Friend, God sees you, but also someone should see you. That's why the church exists. To catch the ones who are slipping, to hold the ones who are hurting, to notice before it's too late, because drift rarely starts as rebellion. It starts as neglect. A slow fade that could have been stopped by a single honest conversation. Here's a Live by Design spotlight. Isolation is the breeding ground for drift. Intimacy is the soil for growth. If you want to grow by design, not by default, open your circle to safe people. Let someone in this week. Ask someone who is safe how they're really doing. And when they ask you back, tell the truth. How you doing has just become a form of greeting. People ask the question, but they're not really open to the answer. But ask someone how they're really doing. And when they ask you back, actually tell them. Tell the truth, because healing happens in honesty. A design check-in question is this. Ask yourself, who in my life really knows how I'm doing spiritually? If the answer is no one, That's where the drift begins. But it can also be where the drift ends. Here's another word to live by. You can't grow where you hide. You can only grow where you're known. Discipleship isn't another meeting on a calendar. It's a mirror for your soul. And when we start walking together again, the church becomes what it was always meant to be. Not a crowd of consumers, but a community of companions. So let's take a breath. Let's pause for 10 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We've talked about a lot today. Performance, consumerism, and the discipleship gap. But at the heart of it all is one simple truth. Your soul was never designed to live exhausted. Somewhere along the line, we start confusing faithfulness with fatigue. We believe that a full schedule meant a full spirit. We measured our devotion by our busyness instead of our being. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the drift began. Because you can be doing everything right for God and still feel far from Him. If church has started to feel heavy for you, if it's begun to feel like pressure instead of peace, I want you to know something. It's not always your fault. Sometimes the system that's supposed to support your faith is unintentionally shaping it around exhaustion. Sometimes we build ministries that prioritize movement over meaning, and we end up mistaking motion for maturity. But here's the good news. You don't have to quit church to find rest. You just need to redefine what church means to you. Maybe God isn't calling you to walk away. Maybe He's calling you to walk differently, to rediscover the joy of His presence inside the very place you once felt burdened. In Matthew 11:28, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." That verse is so familiar that sometimes we forget He was speaking to people burned out on religion, people exhausted from doing all the right things without ever feeling right inside. And Jesus doesn't tell them to do more. He tells them to come closer. Rest isn't rebellion, it's remembrance. It's remembering that God didn't design you to be a machine that performs for Him. He designed you to be a son, a daughter that abides in Him. And when your soul remembers that, the burden begins to lift. So maybe it's time for a reset, not a resignation, a recalibration. What if you gave yourself permission this week to rest without guilt, to take one Sunday and sit with God instead of serving for Him, to be filled before you pour again? Because serving isn't bad, but serving empty is. Here's your Live by Design action step for this week. Name one obligation you can scale back, just one, and replace that time with intentional being, not doing. Maybe it's skipping one meeting to take a prayer walk. Maybe it's saying, not this month, to a new commitment. Maybe it's putting your phone down for 30 minutes and sitting in silence before God. You don't have to earn the rest Jesus already gave you. You just have to receive it. Let's make this personal. Grab your journal or even just your notes app. Apple has a new journaling app that is awesome. I love it. And write this question down or take a voice memo. Where am I confusing busyness with faithfulness? Sit with that. Be honest with yourself, not the polished version, not the ministry mask, just you and God. Because when you start naming the places where performance has replaced presence, you start reclaiming the peace that was stolen by striving. Grace isn't what saves you, it's what sustains you. It's the oxygen your faith needs to breathe again. You don't need to impress God to be loved by Him. He's not grading your faithfulness on attendance sheets or volunteer hours. He's after your heart, not your hustle. And the moment you realize that, you stop seeing rest as rebellion and start seeing it as worship. Because when you rest in God, you're declaring that He's enough. And when you're not producing, even when you're not producing. When you serve from rest, not for worth, your faith stops feeling like a job and starts feeling like joy. That's what this whole series is about. Learning to live by design, not by default. To live from the overflow of intimacy, not the obligation of performance. To build rhythms of rest that keep your soul rooted even when life gets loud. Well, you don't need to quit church. You may just need to rediscover Christ in the midst of it. Because when you stop performing and start abiding, church becomes sacred again. Community feels alive again. And your faith stops being a burden. It becomes a breath of grace. So here's the invitation as we close. Slow down, breathe, return to design, God's design. Let go of the guilt that says you're not doing enough. Release the pressure to prove your worth through service. And remember that your value isn't measured by how much you give, but by the God who already gave everything for you. You were never meant to drift through faith on empty. You were meant to live by design, rested, rooted, and renewed. So until next time, remember, don't just live by default, live by design, God's design. Peace. I want to hear from you truly, because this conversation doesn't end when the episode does. Here are a few questions I'd love for you to reflect on and share in the comments, DMs, or journal. Have you ever felt caught in the performance trap, doing things for God, but feeling far from Him? What's one moment when church felt more like a show than a sanctuary? Third, who in your life knows how you're really doing spiritually? If one of these questions stirs something in you, don't let it fade. Send me an email at jaywilson@truthbetoldproject.com. jaywilson@truthbetoldproject.com. Be looking out for the Facebook group that is coming shortly. You can find the page. I haven't been too active on it, but that is changing. So reach out to me.